The critical question is, how is Andy going to grow up? And what are we going to do as we grow up? So what will happen when Andy is too old for childish things and has to put childish things behind him and grow up and leave for college?
Welcome to Popcorn Parenting, a podcast about the silver screen stories and the saviour. Except today, is it about parenting, plot and predestination? You can decide. Well, you don't have to decide. It is. My name is James Cary, and my co-host, as ever, is the mythologist of the reformed kind, Morgan Locke. Hello, Nate.
Hello, James. It's great to be back for season 3.
It is back, season 3, and therefore Toy Story 3. And it is the third in the trilogy because, of course, there is no such movie as Toy Story 4, at least in Nate's head of denial. Although we may get onto that later, Nate. Is that fair?
Yeah, we probably will. I can never avoid that topic of discussion.
Cold hard facts on Toy Story 3. This is a movie that took $1 billion at the box office in 2010. 11 years after Toy Story 2. It was directed by Lee Unkrich, who also co-directed Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., which I rewatched with my kids the other day and is absolutely joyous, and Finding Nemo. Full disclosure, before we get on to the cold hard facts, Nate, I found this movie traumatic when I saw it back in 2010 or 2011. My kids were very small at that point. One was a baby and the other was 2 or 3. My reaction was, this movie is so traumatic, I don't think I can let my kids watch this movie until they're in their mid-20s. So Nate's mission, should he choose to accept it over the next 30 or so minutes, is to change my mind and insist that my children watch this movie.
We'll get to Inner World in a minute, and it's a fascinating inner world for this one. But I've got a way to lead into that, which hopefully will be seamless. And I'm going to read from this book, Creativity Inc., Overcoming the Unseen Forces That Stand in the Way of True Inspiration. And it's by Ed Catmull, who the front cover tells you is president of Pixar Animation and Disney Animation. So Ed Catmull is one of the founding fathers of Pixar, and this is sort of a corporate autobiography of Pixar. I've read it a few times. It's brilliant. It's interesting if you're interested in animated films, but also the general creative collaborative process. I think it does a really good job of helping you understand that. Anyway, the reason I bring it up today is because chapter 6, Fear and Failure, begins with him telling you about the production of Toy Story 3. So this is what he says. The production of Toy Story 3 could be a masterclass in how to make a film. Well, that's quite a claim already, isn't it?
Fighting talk.
So he says, at the beginning of the process in 2007, the team that had made the original Toy Story gathered for a 2-day offsite in a rustic cabin 50 miles north of San Francisco that often functions as our unofficial retreat center. Don't you want to work at Pixar? Come on, guys, 2 days in a rustic cabin. So sitting on couches with a whiteboard in the center of the room, the participants started by asking some basic questions. Why even do a third movie? What was left to say? What are we still curious about? All very important questions, James. Then somebody said the one thing that snapped everything into focus. We've talked so much over the years in so many different ways about Andy growing up and growing out of his toys. So what if we just leapt right into that idea directly? How would the toys feel if Andy left for college? While no one knew exactly how they'd answer that question, everyone present knew that we'd landed on the idea, the line of tension that would animate Toy Story 3. So he's basically saying Toy Story is about growing up. And in that sense, Toy Story, the whole thing, is about parenting at one level, and or being a child. And obviously, if you've got children, then you're thinking about that. And so the critical question is, how is Andy going to grow up? And what are we going to do as we grow up? So the inner world is in the world of Andy's room, which we know all too well from the previous two films. What will happen when Andy is too old for childish things and has to put childish things behind him and grow up and leave for college? So in a sense, they've put this massive critical moment in a child's life, from going from basically adolescent into adulthood. He's now driving the car that his mom's driving in Toy Story 1. And what's he going to do? Molly, his sister, is grown up a bit. She's not interested in the toys either. So that's why she's going to get rid of Barbie. So essentially then the question set up at the beginning of the film is, what is the destiny of these toys? Where will they end up? And I suppose you've got four kind of options. They can go into the attic, which is where Andy originally wants them to go. They can go and be given away, which obviously at the end of the film is what happens to them. He could keep them and just remain in perpetual childhood, or they can go into the trash, right? Which is a potential destiny for them within the film. But ultimately, the film is about what is the destiny of these toys, given the fact that sort of this significant stage of life is coming to an end. So there's a sort of sense in which Andy the child is dying, and Andy the man is kind of coming to be. And so it just raises massive questions about parenting, about moving on, about the next stage in the journey, the new chapters that we face, all that sort of stuff, and just does it beautifully.
I think that you've referred to the being thrown away. I think that was the bit that I found most traumatic. Is basically when they're heading towards the flames and holding hands, and I remember just thinking, I don't see this as a children's movie. They know that the audience is different for the movie as well. I think that's the other really key factor. This is not 2 years after the original, which has been penciled in when the first one was just about to be released. So so I watched Toy Story 2, presumably roughly when it came out in 1999. It was
99.
When I was, young, single, just left university. I was 19 or 20 or something. And then I had a child and a second on the way or something when I was watching the third one, and you think, wow, I'm different, let alone Andy.
Well, and that's a crucial thing, isn't it? Like, how do you decide when's right to get your child onto the sort of conveyor belt of this particular story or franchise, right? So a lot of parents have it with Harry Potter if they're open to letting their kids read Harry Potter. Of course, lots of people aren't. But if they are, at what point do you let your child start it? Because the books, when they originally came out, took someone through their whole secondary school life, whereas now they're all available. You could probably, if you're an avid reader, smash them all in one summer. And there's a lot that you're probably not going to be ready for. Now, I would say Toy Story 3 isn't for 2-year-olds or infants, right? It's not the first movie that I would show, because it has that massive moment of jeopardy, which we'll look at in more detail later. But there's an interesting thing. They gave it, the American Board of Film Classification, I forget exactly what the acronym is, but they gave it, what's the G rating? It's like they said anyone can basically watch this, and then later on, exactly because of your concern about that scene with the incinerator, they suggested it should be a PG. There is a genuine debate about whether Toy Story 3 has too much darkness for a really young child.
Watching it, I just thought I think this movie is for people who grew up with the second one, who are now older.
Yeah.
It didn't strike me as a kids movie particularly at all. and I've not been minded to go back. I've not seen it again since as well, because I didn't particularly enjoy the experience in retrospect. Whereas I've seen Toy Story 2, I don't know, 10, probably 8, 10 times. Whereas the third one, it's like, well, I've seen that, I've experienced it, and I don't want to go back. And I'm not sure I want to drag my kids through it either.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's got a sweetness and a completeness to it. Again, which we'll look at later on. I remember Barry saying on with you and Cooper and Cary about the oughtness of endings.
Yeah.
Which, if it isn't his phrase, it is now. And I think there's something that's so right about the way that Toy Story 3 ends, which makes the fact that they made a Toy Story 4 such a stupid idea. Did you ever move house when you were a child?
No.
Because neither did I, and neither did my wife. And yet my kids are now living in the third house they've ever lived in.
Wow.
And we're about to leave it and move to another one because we're leaving the US. So we had this moment. We've got a massive house here, which we've just been blessed to have over these sort of few years. And not only are we going to move into a much smaller one when we get back to the UK, but also we have to take everything on the plane, right? So the fact that we've got to get rid of all of our stuff is quite a challenge. And we've accumulated a lot of stuff in this land of the free. And so we were in my son's bedroom just earlier this week, and we had to clear it out because the landlady wanted to do something to the walls. And so we had to tidy it all up. Thought, great opportunity to go through his toy box. He's got loads of toys, every different kind. And to work through, what are we going to give away?
Your very own Toy Story.
What are we going to just trash, right? What are we going to take with us, right? What's special enough to get on the plane, right? And there are hundreds. Like, there's How to Train Your Dragon toys. There's so much Lego. There's Star Wars stuff. There's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles toys. There's Beyblades. There's all these toys that you probably don't know about because you've got girls, which are just so much fun, right? So we played.
Yeah, so mine don't have any toys that seem to be made mostly of weapons.
Yes, I mean, so we actually had to say, right, these ones in the box you can take, and these ones, and it was insanely emotional, right? Now we're a very sentimental family, right? But because we brought some toys with us from the UK when we originally came over, some Lego and some little kind of cars and some teddies, it's like, well, you can't leave that now. Like, that's now got an extra 4 years of sentimentality attached to it. We just got so emotional trying to work out what the destiny of this toy is going to be. So it was exhausting.
So I'm persuaded that this movie is about parenting and stage of life to some extent. But what is this movie saying about that? Because we need to move on to the plot. Or should we do that via the plot?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It is a question of what's going to happen to these toys. And that is a challenge for all parents at some level. Even if you don't move out of your parents' house, presumably at some level, you've got to work out what to do with these toys when you leave home.
You come back from university and discover that your room has been essentially had an ironing board put in it.
Yeah.
And it's got dressmaking stuff in it. And you don't live there anymore. And all your toys that you had sort of laid out and thought you might come back to are now in boxes or been given to jumble sales.
And clearly in this film, it's not about moving home. Toy Story 1 was about that. But this one is about leaving. It is about Andy getting out of that room that he was in. And so the plot of the film and the structure of the film is what happens when there's a mistake, when there's a miscommunication. So Andy is told by his mom, you need to decide what to do with those toys. He takes Woody and he puts Woody in the box to take with him to college. And then the rest of the toys, he goes and grabs a black bin bag and he puts all of those other toys, so Rex and Slinky and Mr. Potato Head and Ham and everyone else, they all go into the bag, and then he's just taking them up to the attic. So he pulls down the little stairs thing, and he's just about to take them up. As he's going up the stairs, His sister comes out with some of her toys that she's having to get rid of because Mum's decided everyone's getting rid of her stuff now. And something drops out of her hand. I can't remember what it is. So because he's a good guy, he's, you know, much nicer than I was to my little sister when I was about to leave for college. He puts the bag down that he was going to take up into the attic, and he goes and helps his sister with the stuff she was doing. As he leaves that, the loft ladder folds itself back up. Mum walks past the landing once Andy's gone, realizes that there's this black bin bag, and thinks, "Oh, well, that's for the trash." So she goes and takes it out and puts it on the curb for the garbage truck. I know I'm using a lot of American phrases rather than just the classic English ones. But
man, to think you used to live in Bath.
I know I've got excuses. The film's set in America, and that's currently where I am. So, anyway, then Woody obviously sees that this has taken place and runs after it to try and get them back. And those toys manage to extricate themselves from the bag using Brex's tail, and choose to jump into the box for Sunnyside Nursery. So they're going to be donated to the preschool place. And then arriving at Sunnyside, they are welcomed by Lotso Hugging Bear, who is a teddy bear that smells of strawberries. And he says, "Welcome to Sunnyside, folks. I'm Lotso Hugging Bear. First thing you have to know about me is I'm a hugger." Lovely, old gent, southerner, warm, friendly. Everything's going to be taken care of you. You're going to be working with these toys. But very quickly, what happens? They discover, of course, that Lotso is not to be trusted because he's an evil dictator who's crushing all other toys with his iron fist. And one of the things that Lotso then says, which I think is very significant, is he says, "No owner, no heartbreak." He appeals to the fact that these children are going to cycle through. You're going to be played with every day. That's what you really want. It doesn't matter who the child is. So you can stay here. You can be sort of looked after by the community of toys, and we'll just have all these children coming through to play with you. But of course, there's a hierarchical system which, you know, forces them to go into some room that they don't want to go into, which isn't age appropriate. And the whole thing's just this big kind of corrupt scam. So I think that the heart of it is like in Toy Story 1, Buzz needed to know he was a toy and a child's plaything. He needed to know his identity. Toy Story 2, Woody needs to know that a toy is to be played with by its owner, not put in a box in a museum. And the final one is, does the owner matter? Does it matter who you're being played with? Or can you just live this kind of itinerant toy life where everyone just sort of runs through? As long as you've been played with, you're okay. So Lotso, the bad guy in this movie, says, "No owner, no heartbreak." Fast forward to Toy Story 4, Bo Peep as the lost toy, living on the edge of society and, you know, kind of with a ragtag band, and they, you know, survive as soldiers of fortune kind of thing. She's arguing exactly the same thing as Lotso.
Right.
Where she's saying, you don't need an owner. We just run off to parties where the children are playing and we get played with, and then we run away from them because all we're after is just this experience. The relationship is irrelevant. And so she appeals to Woody to become a lost toy so that he can have this sort of untethered, like this broken covenant and just live.
I mean, it sounds...
It's so insane that they made Toy Story 4 in the way that they did. And that's what holds us in Toy Story 3, because we know from the beginning of the film that Andy meant to keep the toys.
Yeah.
But that he was interrupted as he was putting them in the loft. And it's by mistake that these toys have ended up in Sunnyside. They were never supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And so this is not the good life. This is not the ideal solution. This is actually something which is going to rub us up the wrong way for the whole of the movie. And of course, it's exposed because he runs it like a prison camp. And it's interesting when Lee Unkrich was talking about the film, his director, he said they watched loads of prison movies in preparation for making this. And you can really tell there's some absolutely brilliant bits. But there's one thing where they've turned Buzz, which is an interesting thing in itself, but they've turned Buzz into the ultimate prison guard to look after all the other toys. And so he's going through the rules of what the life is going to be like. And there's a sandbox out in the yard, and Mr. Potato Head gets carried off there because he's being gobby and all this sort of stuff. And so he's going through the rules, and he says, any toy out after lights out spends the night in the box. Any toy speaking when not spoken to spends the night in the box. And it's all this sort of stuff.
It's a genre, isn't it? It's like solitary confinement is a thing. Any time your movie ends up in a prison, someone's going to end up in solitary confinement because that's the prison within the prison.
Lotso, because of this experience that he has with I forget the name of the girl who looked after him, but because of his experience, becomes resentful, becomes manipulative, and becomes abusive, and so treats all these other toys horribly. We're kind of being shown, look, this is a toy who's dealt in the wrong way with their experience of losing their owner or being lost by their owner. But we also know, and this is what's great, is with Jesse and Bullseye from the previous film, their experience is very similar, and they've been hurt by that experience as their child grew up. But what was the great message? The message was Andy's love, right? There is an owner who can invite you in, even if you've been rejected.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the really positive things that comes out of that. So the question then is, what is the character of Andy, and how does he treat his toys, and how does he honor them and play with them rightfully? And the fact that he gets to decide what goes on with them. Just on before we get on to the final point on the Final Destiny, there's a very funny bit when Buzz gets reset and reprogrammed. Do you remember that bit when they take out his batteries, or they sort of press the reset switch, and then they hold their finger in to his back. The Woody and his friends reset Buzz, who had already been reset by Lotso and the bad guys. They'd return him to factory settings, but then somehow they make a mistake and make him Spanish. So he's just then turns into super like stereotypical romantic Spanish, kind of flamboyant Buzz. He has to learn not to be the Space Ranger in each film at some level.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that makes him more like a sitcom character, which is he's having to learn the same lesson over and over again. Yeah. Which is also true to life. It's why I always say I like sitcoms, because they're truthful. It's because although movies, people go on a journey, our experience of life is that we don't go on a journey, but that we make the same mistake based on the same character flaws pretty much week after week.
Yeah, and that's a really good one if you think about just Christian discipleship. So the fact that Buzz has a particular personality and Woody has a particular personality based upon their kind of cowboy or sheriff and Space Ranger identities. But even the reason why they work as characters repeatedly through films is because that's rooted in something like loyalty or responsibility or leadership or tradition or whatever else it might be.
Obedience to the rules, yeah.
Whereas, for Buzz, it's kind of this, I fit into the world as a kind of cog in a machine.
He's basically he's a Marine, isn't he?
Yeah.
So we've done our two Ps. we've talked a bit about parenting. We've talked a bit about the plot. Now, how on earth do we get from that to predestination? Or is it destiny, really?
Well, it is destiny, but I think, like I mentioned before, the oughtness of the ending. We know that it should be Andy who gets to decide eventually. And so that there is an interesting point when Andy's, after the toys have been rescued, and we'll talk about that rescue in a little bit, but once they're finally back in Andy's room, like the stories kind of come complete full circle, where the question is, Andy, what are you going to do with these toys? He says to his mum, after Woody's written this address of Bonnie on this box, he says to his mum, do you think I should donate these? And then out of shot, you hear her say, it's up to you, hon. And that's basically what we knew at the beginning of the films. Like, it was up to Andy, but because of his kindness to his sister and his mum's sort of misunderstanding, the toys ended up going through this whole mess in the first place. So now we're back at kind of Act 1, Scene 1, in a sense. With that scene, it's up to you, Andy. And we go, yes, it is. They're Andy's toys. We've been with Andy as he's played with them over 3 films. So he should get to decide. And then when we see him arrive at Bonnie's house, which is just, I mean, a gorgeous, gorgeous scene where he introduces each of these toys to Bonnie and says, you know, this is, you know, evil Dr. Porkchop or One-Eyed Bart or the Rex and as a dinosaur and stuff, and Buzz Lightyear. And then because Bonnie's already met Woody from earlier on in the film, she says, oh, my cowboy. And then we see Andy have to make the decision, what am I actually going to do with Woody? Do I take him to college with me, or do I leave him here in this garden with this girl where he can play? Now, at this point, the kind of Andy as sovereign lord kind of thing, you know, falls apart because the Lord saves us for himself. But Andy will choose to give Woody this life back in a beautiful garden, a life to be played with again. And I just think from the predestination point, we have all sorts of questions. You know, how does it work? It doesn't feel like God's deciding everything we choose to do. It feels like we're making the decision. And, you know, what about those who aren't saved? And so thousands of questions that we have about predestination, and legitimate questions, which you ought to have, you're thinking. But what this film shows you is that it's up to Andy. Yeah. Andy gets to choose what happens. It would be wrong for something to happen to these toys, whether it's ending up in the incinerator or going to Sunnyside or whatever.
Yeah.
And it wasn't his choice. They belonged to him. But to go back to the incinerator, which is they do properly drag out that scene where all the toys are looking at each other as they're about to go in. And there must be something like 20 shots or something, and it's like a minute or so as they're dun, dun, and you can't imagine a much more, you know, fire and brimstone image than what's happening.
Yeah, it's absolutely,
right? This absolute inevitable fall into the fire, and we all know, like, this is terrible. This is the worst thing that could happen, right? And yet everyone knows the ending of this film anyway, but the claw swoops down and picks them up, right? They look up and this claw comes down, picks them up, snatches them out of the jaws of death and lifts them off and separates them out so that they're going to be safe. And then we look to who's controlling the claw, and it's the 3 Pizza Planet aliens. And they're like, the claw, you have been chosen. And then they're put down. Now, when that bit happened in the film, when we watched it this week, my daughter said, that's what Toy Story 4 should have been. And I was like, what? It's like, how did the aliens get into the room to use the claw? And I was like, there we go. That's some fan fiction we can get on board with.
You've saved our lives. We're eternally grateful.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what was so poetic and so sweet about it, and why Toy Story 3 was such a beautiful closing of the canon, if you like, because the filmmakers, who never intended to make a Toy Story 3, right? They didn't really think they were going to make a Toy Story 2, but they realized that they could not sort of bookend. They could use this symbol of the claw choosing and bring it to this kind of literary fulfillment by having, rather than the aliens being chosen, they become the ones who choose. This salvation model is kind of flipped in a sense. It's such a piece of poetic justice. It's so apt.
Right.
And that's why, as soon as someone suggested going off to some retreat in the 50 miles outside of Los Angeles to write a screenplay or a treatment for Toy Story 4, everyone in that room should have just been shot. They should have been, how dare you? Like, don't you realize how well you ended that off? It was perfect.
What are we talking about afterwards with our kids? Beyond, what was your favourite bit? Yeah. Which character do you like? You know, you've given us the York notes. You've given us the study guide, as it were. But we now need the discussion points. Give us a couple of nudges in our, in the right direction.
So I mean, we talked about this with the other two films. So we said Toy Story 1. You can ask, whose name would be written on the bottom of your shoe. And that's a theme that runs through all of the films, is this idea of belonging. And so it's a similar sort of conversation, who do you belong to? And who has the sort of the right to decide what happens to you? Who gets to make that decision? So there's that conversation that you can have with your kids. Like, why would it have been wrong for the toys to have just ended up in the butterfly room at Sunnyside?
Yeah.
And Andy never knew that they weren't in the attic. And 5 years later, he comes back and says, "Hey, what happened to my Mr. Potato Head?" And his mum's like, "I don't know. We must have lost it." So there's a question there about what who we belong to.
Yeah.
But I think, and in a weird way, and I want to get into more specific, just the parenting that we have to do, rather than only thinking about the sort of the theological side of our parenting, which is talking to our children way before, it actually happens, about their life in terms of leaving and cleaving.
Yeah.
About what that's going to look like, and coming to terms ourselves as parents with the idea that we're growing these children up not to be our children for the rest of their lives, but to live, as those in relationship with the Lord, and to have their own lives, and to live in their own houses, and to have their own children, and to be kind of separate from us. And one sort of little step on that is if you move house, or if your child's going to leave home, or what you do with the toys that they've grown out of, helping your child see that growing up involves this leaving of childish things behind, and asking some questions about, like, what toys do we think we couldn't live without? Like, what would it be like if we did give Lightning McQueen away? What does that mean, right? And sensitively and aware of our children's kind of emotional sort of situation. But I think this franchise, the Toy Story films 1, 2, and 3, are so helpful for us as parents of thinking about our children's emotional development in a theological kind of framework. And so questions about growing up, questions about what, if you had to go to college right now, what 10 things would you want to take with you?
I think my final reflection on that, I'm really interested in the ownership of the toys thing, and clearly you've already gotten over that. I think that is such a big theme, and the only thing I can add to this really is I always say that I've learned more about my relationship with God through having my own children. And the way in which my children relate to me is that is a picture of how I relate to God. And I sort of rant and rail and wish that God would do this or that. And I don't understand why he doesn't give me the things that I want, in the same way that your kids don't understand why you don't permanently just give them sugar. And it's kind of obvious, you're an idiot, so you want the wrong things. I'm an idiot and I want the wrong things. But actually you think kids don't experience that, but actually they don't experience the ownership of these are my kids, but they do have that ownership of this is my toy. So I think that there is something about that which I think can be, because my kids have each got bedtime toys still. My eldest is 13 and she's still got a toy that my wife gave her that she had as a kid, and it's really special to her.
Okay.
And my other daughter's got different ones from sort of different sources. And they are really possessive about them. And I think, there's a conversation to be had there about how you feel about that thing is actually how God feels about you. And that's no small thing.
And an absolutely brilliant place to look at that is, and I think we've mentioned this before, but Moses at Sinai, and the Lord says, though the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a treasured possession. And so if your child has a treasured possession, something that they, couldn't give away or would be distraught if it was lost or destroyed, we can go to them and say, think about how you feel about that. We're not projecting this onto God. God says this in his word about us, about his people, that we are his treasured possession. So yes, we don't want to store up treasures for ourselves on earth where moth and moth destroys, but we want to store them in heaven. But think about how the Lord views us, exactly as you say, and I think that's in the whole Toy Story kind of canon is the key thing to draw out. It's what's that relationship? How much does the Lord love us and care for us?
I think that's a good place to end. Thanks very much for your Toy Story thoughts. Thank you very much for giving us our 3 Ps of the day. We can tell, of course, that you're an evangelical. Not only do we have popcorn parenting, but we have parenting, plot, and predestination. So thank you very much, Nate.
Thank you very much, James.
Thanks for listening. Speak to you next time.
And I could see like IV was written on there. I was like, oh, does that say NIV? Pixar put a Bible into Andy's box for college. I turned my head upside down and realized that it says volume A. The V was actually an A, and the I was actually a 1. And it wasn't an NIV, and I was distraught. But,
and because of that, that's why I'm going to cut that bit out of the final edit.